Hi, this is review video 3 for Early Music Appreciation Exam 3, and we left off talking about the Concerto Grosso, but there really was another question about the Concerto Grosso underneath that question, and that was what are the main traits of the Concerto and Concerto Grosso, and how are they different? Well, I already answered that in the last video. Remember, the Concerto Grosso has multiple solo instruments that are performing in contrast with the orchestra, with the Baroque orchestra. Okay, and how many movements does a typical concerto have? Well, whether we're talking about a regular concerto or a Concerto Grosso, we're going to have 3 movements in a concerto of the Baroque era. And that could change later on, but in the Baroque era, we're looking at 3 movements. The typical formation of that also was a fast movement, contrasted with a slow movement, and ending with another fast movement. Usually the last movement, by the way, was even faster than the first, but I think that's extra stuff. I probably won't ask that on the exam, but it's good to know. Maybe in your essay you could mention, oh, if you hear an orchestra, for example, I believe it could be the first or the third movement of a concerto. If you can tell that there's a solo instrument or multiple solo instruments in contrast with the orchestra, that would be a really good thing to add into your essay. Okay, moving on, and by the way, this is Boca! She's really great. And she will not leave me alone. She wants to be a part of this video too. Alright, next question. Actually, let's talk about ritornello form because typically the first movement of a Baroque concerto will be in ritornello form, and that's one of the terms that you need to be familiar with. Basically, ritornello form is based upon returning. Ritornello, think return. And what happens is the orchestra states the ritornello or the ritornello theme at the start, but we constantly come back to that. And so there's a constant repetition of that original idea. In other words, the form is based on a periodic or regular return of a central musical theme by the orchestra. We listened to Antonio Vivaldi's violin concerto in D, La Stravaganza. Yes, that was a violin concerto by Vivaldi. And we listened to the first movement, which was in ritornello form. The next question is about the musical term for work. So, in other words, a composer's work, if they're going to catalog their work or collect their work, they're called opus. O-P-U-S. It's often shortened to just an O and a small p. And that's an important question to be able to answer. So the musical term for work is opus. The next question, what was Antonio Vivaldi's nickname and where did he teach? Vivaldi was known as the Red Priest because he had shockingly red hair, and at least for a while he was a priest. And he worked at a girls' orphanage in Italy, and he wrote a lot of pieces for those girls to perform, which is kind of neat. By the way, Vivaldi's most famous concerto for violin is the Four Seasons. I don't think that's on the exam, but you can't leave this music appreciation class without knowing that. The Four Seasons was written by Antonio Vivaldi, and it's a group of 4 violin concerti. Okay. Now, here's one that actually I did not mention in class. It is in your book, but I will give you the answer right now. The question is, which composer copied many pages of Vivaldi's concertos in learning how to write in this genre? The answer to that is J.S. Bach. He learned a lot from copying out the music of other composers. The next question, a form in which a single melodic unit is repeated with successive changes to arouse the listener's interest is called variation form. Okay, do not be confused by this idea of a single theme. You can start to think, oh, it might be a canon, it might be a passacaglia, it might be a fugue. But no, specifically when it's repeated with successive changes designed as a form to keep our interest, that is called variation form. Next question's an easy one. I already mentioned it earlier in one of the videos. How many Brandenburg concertos did Bach write? We listened to number 5, but there was one more written There are 6 Brandenburg concertos, and what's interesting is that they all feature different groups of soloists. Remember, they're concerto grossos or grossi, concerti grossi, concerti grosso. I don't know. They're all examples of concerto grosso. There you go. The next question has a fill in the blank. The blank was the main instrument on which Bach performed. Remember, he worked in churches. What instrument was the most important instrument in the church, other than the voice? The organ. So Bach was an avid and fantastic organist. And he didn't do much travel because he worked with a church, right? If he had worked mainly for a court, which he did for a little while, but his main position later on in life was he was in charge of a large church, which was also in charge of smaller churches. But what that means is that he did not get a chance to travel that much. And he did, though, ask for leave on 2 occasions, and he actually walked a ridiculous distance. I think it was 200 miles at one point, just to see another organist performing, a very famous organist. So, anyhow, totally an extra bit of information, but interesting nonetheless. At the end of his career, how was Bach seen by his contemporaries? We've talked about this. He was seen as an old fogey. He was seen as old-fashioned. He was still using some of the old names for his compositions. He was still writing in older genres. But what's interesting is that he was bringing those genres to a whole new level. What is the collection of 48 preludes and fugues by Bach called? That's called the Well-Tempered Clavier. Do not confuse that with the Art of Fugue. The Art of Fugue was comprised of 20 different canons and fugues, all based on the same subject. So the Art of Fugue he wrote at the end of his life. It was all on the same subject. There were canons and fugues. But the Well-Tempered Clavier, that includes 48 works of preludes and fugues. Got it? Good. Okay. What is the most defining aspect or element of fugue? A little bit of a typo in the review sheet. Sorry about that. In other words, what device distinguishes it from other types of compositions from the late Baroque era? And the answer to that is systemized imitative polyphony. We've had tons of imitative polyphony before. We had tons of that even in the Renaissance era. But here it's systematized. What I mean by systematized is it's following a really strict set of rules. There's a system to it. A very specific system, and that made fugue fairly difficult to compose, but it makes it really interesting to listen to. Okay, just a quick reminder too, there'll be terms on the aspects of the fugue, and that's all in the last chapter that we covered. And terms that you'll need to be familiar with are the subject, which is the main part of the fugue. The subject is stated in the exposition in the different lines of the fugue. Remember, lines are like voices. Voices, lines, you can use both words. And that means a higher voice or a medium voice or a medium low voice or a low voice. So soprano, alto, tenor, bass are the different voice types that can be used in fugue. Now remember, when new material is presented in a section of fugue, where after we've stated the subject, all the lines have had a chance to state their subject, when the new material is happening, that's called an episode. Okay? Who wrote the Art of Fugue? We already covered this. J.S. Bach wrote the Art of Fugue. He was the king of fugue. What are stylized dances and what were they intended for? They are meant for listening, not dancing to. That's the thing to remember about stylized dances. They were used for dance suites, which was a very typical form of the Baroque era. It's an instrumental form, so there's no singing. It's all instruments. Could be for keyboard, could be for lute, could be for orchestra as well. But the key thing to remember is that it was not designed to be danced to. Okay, that brings this video 3 to a close for exam number 3, and stay tuned for video number 4.